The first death threat letter was slipped into Billie Holiday's dressing room just 3 days after she performed Strange Fruit at Café Society in 1939. "Sing that song again, and gardenias will be the flowers at your grave," it read. But Holiday didn't flinch, because that song wasn't just a performance for her. It was giving voice to her ancestors' pain. Every Strange Fruit performance put her in greater danger while simultaneously disturbing America's conscience even more. Record companies' rejections, radio stations' boycotts, and the FBI's systematic surveillance proved just how powerful this song truly was. This isn't just the story of a song, it's the documented account of how America systematically destroyed one of its greatest artists for telling an uncomfortable truth. If this content matters to you, subscribe for more untold stories from jazz's golden age. What followed Holiday's breakthrough performance was not celebration but persecution. Within weeks of Strange Fruit gaining popularity, a coordinated campaign emerged to limit its reach and punish those who supported it. Record companies that had previously courted Holiday suddenly found reasons to avoid recording the song. Columbia Records, Holiday's label at the time, refused to even discuss putting Strange Fruit on vinyl, claiming it was too political for their catalog. When Holiday finally found a small label willing to record it, major distributors refused to carry it, effectively blacklisting the song from mainstream commercial success. Radio stations received visits from Federal Narcotics Bureau agents who suggested that playing certain songs might indicate communist sympathies or anti-American sentiment. Program directors, fearful of losing their broadcasting licenses, quietly removed Strange Fruit from playlists even before it had a chance to gain radio momentum. The few stations brave enough to play it faced immediate backlash, not just from listeners, but from sponsors who threatened to pull their advertising dollars. This wasn't censorship in the traditional sense. It was economic strangulation designed to make the song disappear without official bans that might attract unwanted attention to the suppression effort. Holiday began receiving threats not just through anonymous letters, but through more sophisticated intimidation tactics. Hotel reservations would mysteriously disappear when she arrived for bookings. Venues would suddenly discover scheduling conflicts that required canceling her performances. Musicians who worked with her reported being questioned by federal agents about Holiday's personal habits, political beliefs, and associations. The message was clear: supporting Billie Holiday and her dangerous song would have consequences for anyone brave enough to stand with her. April 20, 1939. The date remains burned into the memory of everyone who witnessed Billie Holiday's first performance of Strange Fruit at Café Society. The club's usual chatter died to absolute silence as Holiday's voice wrapped around Mirapol's haunting lyrics, transforming words on paper into something that felt like a funeral dirge for America's soul. In the audience that night sat not only jazz enthusiasts and social progressives, but also federal agents who would later file reports describing Holiday as a dangerous influence on American youth. The applause that followed was different from anything the club had ever heard. It was the sound of people processing collective guilt. Holiday herself felt the song's power immediately. She later told friends that singing Strange Fruit was like opening a vein. It connected her to every lynching victim, every family torn apart by racial violence, every silent scream that had gone unheard. The song demanded everything from her emotionally, and she gave it willingly, even though she sensed from that very first performance that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Entertainment had rules in 1939 America, and Strange Fruit shattered every single one of them. But the most significant presence in that audience wasn't the critics or the celebrities. It was the beginning of a surveillance operation that would follow Holiday for the rest of her life. Federal agents had begun attending her performances not for the music, but to monitor what they considered seditious activity disguised as art. From that April night forward, every venue that booked Holiday, every radio station that played her records, and every person who supported her career would face scrutiny from government agencies determined to silence the song that was making America face its darkest truths. Abel Mirapol never intended to write a song that would alter the course of American music history, The Jewish schoolteacher from the Bronx had witnessed a lynching photograph that haunted his dreams, and in 1937 he poured his horror into a poem called Bitter Fruit. Meeropol, who taught at DeWitt Clinton High School by day, spent his evenings writing under the pen name Lewis Allen, crafting verses that spoke to social injustice with a clarity that made people uncomfortable. When he transformed his poem into a song, he had no idea it would become both a masterpiece and a death sentence for the woman who would make it famous. The poem sat in Meeropol's drawer for nearly 2 years before fate intervened. Through a series of connections in New York's progressive circles, the song found its way to Café Society, the integrated nightclub in Greenwich Village that dared to challenge segregation's stranglehold on entertainment. Barney Josephson, the club's owner, had built his venue on the radical idea that black and white patrons could share the same space, enjoy the same music, and confront the same truths together. But even Josephson couldn't have predicted what would happen when Strange Fruit met Billie Holiday's voice. As the pressure mounted, Holiday's personal life began reflecting the strain of being marked as a target. Friends noticed changes in her behavior, increased paranoia about being followed, reluctance to discuss certain topics even in private, and a growing dependence on alcohol and drugs to cope with the constant stress. The woman who had once been spontaneous and joyful became guarded and suspicious, never knowing which audience member might be reporting back to federal authorities or which conversation might be overheard by the wrong person. The song's impact on Holiday went deeper than external pressures. Every time she performed Strange Fruit, she relived not just the historical trauma it depicted, but her own experiences with racism and violence. The song became a portal to her darkest memories, the poverty of her Baltimore childhood, the abuse she had suffered, the daily humiliations of living as a black woman in Jim Crow America. What made her performance so powerful also made it personally devastating, turning each rendition into an act of self-sacrifice that demanded pieces of her soul. Yet Holiday refused to abandon the song, even when industry professionals advised her that doing so would restore her commercial prospects and ease the government's scrutiny. She understood that Strange Fruit had transcended entertainment to become something approaching sacred, a musical monument to every lynching victim who had died without justice. Abandoning it would feel like betraying not just Meeropol's artistic vision, but the memory of countless Americans whose stories had never been told. This sense of responsibility became both her greatest strength and her heaviest burden. The song's international reception proved that America's attempts at suppression had failed. European critics hailed Strange Fruit as one of the most important American artworks of the century, a musical equivalent to the literature of protest that had emerged from oppressed peoples throughout history. When Holiday finally did perform overseas, audiences understood they were hearing not just entertainment but testimony, the voice of someone who had suffered for speaking truth to power. These international performances became acts of cultural diplomacy that contradicted official American narratives about racial progress and freedom. Paris embraced Holiday and Strange Fruit with an enthusiasm that stood in stark contrast to her reception in America. French intellectuals saw in the song everything they admired about American art: its honesty, its emotional power, and its willingness to confront difficult truths. When Holiday performed at the Olympia Theater in 1954, the audience's response was so overwhelming that she was forced to perform Strange Fruit 3 times in a single evening. European critics wrote that Americans who rejected Holiday were rejecting their own artistic genius, making cultural choices that diminished their nation's standing in the world community. The contrast between Holiday's European reception and her American persecution became a source of international embarrassment for the United States. Cold War propaganda about American freedom and equality rang hollow when one of America's greatest artists was being systematically destroyed by her own government. Soviet publications frequently highlighted Holiday's treatment as evidence of American hypocrisy, using her story to counter U.S. criticisms of communist oppression. This international attention added another layer of pressure to the domestic campaign against Holiday, as authorities found themselves defending their actions on a global stage. Despite every effort to suppress it, Strange Fruit refused to disappear. Underground networks of jazz enthusiasts passed bootleg recordings hand to hand, treating them like forbidden literature in an oppressive regime. College students gathered in dorm rooms to listen to Holiday's voice deliver Meeropol's devastating lyrics, understanding that they were witnessing something that official America desperately wanted them to never hear. Folk singers began incorporating the song into their repertoires, each new performer adding their voice to what was becoming a growing chorus of resistance. What the authorities hadn't anticipated was the song's appeal to America's intellectual and artistic communities. Writers like Langston Hughes and James Baldwin referenced strange fruit in their work, using Holiday's courage as inspiration for their own truth-telling. Jazz musicians developed instrumental versions that captured the song's haunting melody while avoiding the controversial lyrics, creating a musical code that allowed the song's essence to survive even when its words were banned. Record collectors treated original pressings like precious artifacts, understanding that they possessed something the government wanted to erase from American culture. The Catholic Church's response to Strange Fruit revealed another unexpected dimension of its impact. Progressive priests began referencing the song in sermons about social justice, drawing parallels between Christ's crucifixion and the lynchings the song depicted. This religious framing gave the song a moral authority that transcended its political implications, making suppression attempts appear not just authoritarian but blasphemous. Conservative church leaders found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to explain why a song about human suffering should be silenced, particularly when its imagery so closely mirrored Christian themes of sacrifice and redemption. Documents released decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed the true scope of the federal government's interest in Billie Holiday and Strange Fruit. Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, had identified Holiday as a person of interest not primarily because of her drug use, but because of her association with what he termed protest music that undermines American values. Anslinger's files on Holiday grew to over 300 pages, documenting her performances, recording sessions, travel patterns, and personal relationships with the thoroughness typically reserved for espionage cases. The government's strategy was ingenious in its cruelty. Rather than martyring Holiday by directly censoring Strange Fruit, agents focused on destroying her personally and professionally through her vulnerabilities. They encouraged her drug dealers to provide information about her habits, pressured her romantic partners to spy on her activities, and used her arrests as opportunities to search for evidence of communist connections or anti-government sentiment. Every aspect of her private life became potential ammunition in the campaign to discredit both her and her most powerful song. Federal agents also worked behind the scenes to limit Holiday's international opportunities. When she received invitations to perform in Europe, where Strange Fruit was celebrated as a masterpiece of social commentary, State Department officials intervened to suggest that her travel might not be in America's best interests. The goal was to prevent Holiday from finding audiences who might appreciate her artistry without the racial prejudices that limited her domestic reception. By keeping her confined to an American music scene increasingly hostile to her message, authorities hoped to gradually erode her influence and significance. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s, Strange Fruit found new relevance and new performers willing to brave the consequences of singing it. Each artist who took on the song faced some version of the persecution Holiday had endured, but the growing movement provided safety in numbers that she had never enjoyed. The song that had isolated Holiday in 1939 became a rallying cry for a generation of activists who understood that change required confronting uncomfortable truths, regardless of the personal cost. Nina Simone's early performances of Strange Fruit demonstrated how the song had evolved beyond Holiday's specific experience to become a universal anthem of resistance. Simone approached the song with a classical training that gave it orchestral grandeur while maintaining its emotional devastation. Her performances proved that Strange Fruit could survive different interpretations while retaining its power to disturb and inspire. When Simone sang the song at civil rights rallies, audiences understood they were participating in a tradition of musical protest that Holiday had established at great personal cost. The song's influence extended beyond music into other forms of artistic expression. Painters created visual interpretations of Meeropol's imagery, while poets wrote verses inspired by Holiday's courage in performing it. Theater directors began incorporating Strange Fruit into dramatic productions about American history, using the song as a bridge between entertainment and education. This artistic proliferation ensured that even if the song disappeared from radio and recordings, its message would survive through multiple cultural channels that authorities couldn't control or monitor effectively. Looking back, Billie Holiday's decision to perform Strange Fruit represents one of the most significant acts of artistic courage in American history. In choosing to give voice to America's victims, she knowingly accepted a role that would destroy her personally while creating something larger than any individual life. The song became proof that art could still matter in ways that terrified those in power, and that one woman's voice could force an entire nation to confront truths it preferred to keep hidden. The campaign against Holiday and Strange Fruit revealed the lengths to which American institutions would go to suppress dissent, even when that dissent came wrapped in the beauty of artistic expression. Her persecution became a preview of the tactics that would later be used against civil rights leaders, anti-war protesters, and other Americans who dared to challenge official narratives. In destroying Holiday, the government created a template for silencing troublesome artists that would echo through decades of American cultural history. Yet Holiday's sacrifice was not in vain. Strange Fruit survived every attempt at suppression to become one of the most important songs in American history. It opened a path for protest music that continues to this day, proving that art can be both beautiful and dangerous, that truth-telling remains a revolutionary act, and that some battles are worth fighting even when victory seems impossible. Billie Holiday paid the ultimate price for singing that song, but in doing so she ensured that America could never again claim ignorance about the violence at the heart of its racial history. The woman who died in a hospital bed in 1959, still under police surveillance even in her final moments, had succeeded in ways she might never have imagined. Strange Fruit had indeed changed America, not by converting every heart or ending every injustice, but by making silence about racial violence impossible to maintain. In the end, that song didn't just reveal America's darkest truths, it demanded that future generations find the courage to face them. By the mid-1950s, the cumulative effects of years of harassment had taken their toll on Holiday's health and career. The constant stress of being surveilled, the difficulty of finding steady work, and the emotional drain of repeatedly performing a song that reopened psychological wounds had accelerated her physical decline. Friends noticed that she seemed older than her years, carrying herself with the weariness of someone who had borne more than her share of the world's pain. Yet she continued performing Strange Fruit, even as her voice grew more fragile and her performances more infrequent. The tragic irony of Holiday's situation was that the song that had made her a target had also secured her artistic immortality. Music historians were already recognizing Strange Fruit as a watershed moment in American culture, the point at which popular music had definitively crossed from entertainment into social commentary. But this historical significance provided little comfort to Holiday, who paid for her artistic courage with increasing isolation, deteriorating health, and the knowledge that her government viewed her as an enemy rather than a citizen exercising her constitutional rights. Holiday's final performances of Strange Fruit carried an additional layer of meaning that audiences sensed even if they couldn't articulate it. She was no longer just singing about historical lynchings. She was performing her own slow execution, the systematic destruction of an artist whose only crime had been making America confront its own reflection. Every note became both an act of defiance and a step closer to the conclusion that had seemed inevitable since that first night at Café Society when she chose truth over safety.